Support for Lab Out Loud is provided by NSTA, the National Science Teaching Association. Find out more about what NSTA has to offer at nsta.org. You're listening to Lab Out Loud, Science for the Classroom and beyond. And in this episode, we're learning about pumpkins.
So we generally call round-fruited forms pumpkins. Pumpkin is actually from an old French word, pompion, which meant melon or gourd. When the early French explorers in the Mississippi River Valley saw the pumpkins and squash that were being grown by the native tribes, and they didn't know what they were because nobody in Europe had ever seen a pumpkin. And so they assumed that they must be watermelons because that was the only big round cucurbit fruit they'd ever seen.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud. But first, I'm your co-host, Dale Basler.
And I am Brian Bartel.
Today's episode is a bit of a seasonal episode. We like to take something from the season and kind of do a deep dive in the science of it. We've done this before with turkeys by calling the Butterball hotline and asking as many turkey-related science questions we could. And we've also talked to people who farm trees for Christmas tree farms. And today is very similar to that. We wanted to find someone who could teach us more about pumpkins. And boy, did we hit the jackpot.
I actually did my PhD work on pumpkins and pumpkin breeding.
Not only does today's guest share their knowledge about pumpkins, but other things in the agricultural world too, like gourds, squash, pumpkin seeds, and even a little bit about that so-called pumpkin spice. Let's meet our guest now.
I'm Dr. Rebecca Brown, and I'm a professor of plant sciences at the University of Rhode Island, where I run the vegetable program doing research, teaching courses for undergrads, and also working with farmers and gardeners and anyone who's interested in vegetable production to help them learn sustainable local scale vegetable production.
How did you get into that line of research?
So I actually went to graduate school to be a plant breeder. I was going to be a vegetable breeder. And while I was in grad school, the vegetable seed industry in the United States underwent a big contraction. So there basically weren't any jobs. And I wound up getting a job at the university as part of the agriculture program.
The closest I know to vegetable breeder is like I've seen these people who raise like hot peppers, like really hot peppers, and they're brushing from one plant to another. Is that anywhere in the same world?
Yes, it actually is. So those folks are hobby vegetable breeders.
Okay.
They also actually exist in the pumpkin world. People breed giant pumpkins.
Oh, yeah.
In much the same way that people breed show dogs, in terms of they've got pedigrees and you do careful controlled matings and you pamper these things.
How do you pamper a pumpkin?
You pamper a pumpkin by giving it special fertilizer and making sure that there are no weeds, no insects.
Oh, okay. Sure.
No
Singing
diseases.
Nora Jones.
But also, when you're talking giant pumpkins for show pumpkins, they tuck them in at night under blankets. They turn the fruit every day so that it grows to the right shape. Lots of things that a farmer who's just growing jack-o'-lantern pumpkins for sale would never bother with.
Yeah,
because
we're talking those really, really, like you can sit inside them giant pumpkins, right?
That's what we're talking about, yes.
What's the history of those kinds of pumpkins? Like, where did we, kind of like what you talked about dogs, did we breed them to get those crazy sizes?
Yes, actually. So, first of all, you need to know that those pumpkins are a different species from your standard jack-o'-lantern pumpkin. Jack-o'-lantern pumpkins are Cucurbita pepo, and the giant pumpkins are Cucurbita maxima. So Cucurbita maxima starts out with a lot more potential for large, heavy fruit. And then the giant pumpkins were originally developed actually as livestock feed. They were grown in places like Minnesota by dairy farmers, and you would feed them to the cattle in the winter. This was back before the days of widespread use of corn silage. So the cows were eating hay mostly, but cows don't do well on a diet that's just hay.
Yeah.
And so the idea was take these pumpkins, you could pile them up in a corner of the barn. Comes time to feed the animals, you cut them up with an axe, toss them into the feeding trough, and the cows eat them.
Wow. I grew up on a dairy farm. I never heard of cows eating pumpkin.
Yep.
So
yeah, this was, we're talking 1800s.
Pre-corn.
Here. Yeah. We're talking 1800s here.
Wow.
Dale's not that old.
Yeah.
Now, you did undergraduate work in Minnesota, if I'm not mistaken.
I did, actually, and my master's. I got my master's in plant breeding from the University of Minnesota. I did my undergrad at St. Olaf College.
Okay. Now, when you're talking about industrial kinds of breeding, you're talking, Dale mentioned like a hobbyist, right?
Yep.
And we have industrial breeders for livestock, like bull, there's people that travel around with bull semen in the back of their truck, for instance. What does an industrial breeder for agriculture look like?
So, it depends a lot on what crop you're breeding. Many of our crop plants fertilize themselves, so you don't need to worry about traveling around with pollen, which would be the equivalent of your bull semen.
You don't need special liquid nitrogen tanks for that?
You do not. You do not need special liquid nitrogen tanks for pollen. And generally with plants, we grow the two parents right next to each other. So nobody's traveling around with anything.
Okay.
Of course, your average squash plant is a much easier critter to handle than your typical stud bull.
Sure. You don't need quite the gloves and the,
Yeah.
Not as wild.
With pumpkins, actually, when they breed pumpkins, and most of the jack-o'-lantern pumpkins out there are F1 hybrids, which means that they're a result of a deliberate cross between two different parents. The way they do it is they plant alternating rows of the two parents in the pumpkin field, and then they use the plant hormone ethylene to control flowering and make pumpkin plants flower in waves. So first they'll produce male flowers, then they produce female flowers, then they produce male flowers. And they can use the ethylene to alter the order of flowering so that you can make the female parent have female flowers at the same time as the male parent has male flowers.
Oh, sort of like Barry White for plants.
Yes, and then you put bees, either honeybees or bumblebees, in the field. And you let the bees move the pollen from the male flowers to the female flowers.
So I didn't realize that there were you'd grow them specifically like this as a male row and a female row next to each other. And I'm sure a lot of students don't either. Do we see that in a lot of...
That's the pistillate and staminate, right?
Right.
Correct.
Right. And that's when you're trying to produce the seed that the farmer would then use to grow the pumpkins that we carve and put on our front steps.
Okay.
So there's a lot of science that's really in this process that you would want to know or need to know in order to control your outcome.
Yeah, especially if you're doing seed production. Most pumpkin farmers, of course, aren't pumpkin seed farmers. They're pumpkin farmers.
Oh, okay.
And so they're going to buy this hybrid seed from their seed supplier and plant it in their field and grow up pumpkins and then sell the pumpkins. But there's a lot of science in that, too.
So I'll see a lot of pumpkin patches out there, but most likely that's just growing pumpkins, not for seed. Is there a certain kind of hot spot where pumpkin seeds are grown?
Well, a lot of the vegetable seed in general in the United States is grown in the Pacific Northwest, Idaho, Washington, Oregon, partly because of the dry summer, which controls a lot of diseases. And then vegetable seed production is a rather specialized industry, and it's sort of gotten concentrated in that area. But you do get pumpkin seed production in other places. You know, sometimes it's close to the company that's doing the breeding. So like there's a big pumpkin and squash breeding company in Colorado. There's another one that I work with in Maine, and I think they grow a lot of their seed right there in Maine. They usually contract with farmers. So, you know, it can be wherever there are farmers who have the right expertise and equipment and conditions.
Sure. I feel like initially I started on this asking how you got into the research you do, and we talked about breeding, and I got too excited about the big pumpkins that I never let you finish the rest of the story. So you were originally going to go into like industrial vegetable breeding, correct?
Yes.
And then, so what came next?
Well, so basically there weren't any jobs. And
yes.
Yeah. And so I wound up getting actually into molecular genetics when that was a new field, and got a position at the University of Rhode Island. But then I was working on turf grass here. But in 2008, the turf grass industry collapsed. And at the same time, local food production really took off. And there was nobody to do the vegetable work. So I started working with vegetables again. I actually did my PhD work on pumpkins and pumpkin breeding. Yeah.
Wow.
I'm still kind of thinking about the seeds here because, of course, one of the one of the hallmarks of carving jack-o'-lanterns is harvesting the seeds and baking them up. And so our students might be thinking like, well, I have pumpkin seeds. Can I just use those? Are they different than the ones that you were describing harvesting from these seed factories, essentially?
Well, so yes and no. You can take the seeds out of your jack-o'-lantern and plant them, and they will grow. Okay. They will, however, not produce a pumpkin that looks like the pumpkin you took them out of.
Why is that?
Well, so there's two reasons for that. First of all, the pumpkin that you took them out of was probably one of these F1 hybrids. So, with the two very different parents. And the seed of an F1 hybrid is what we call the F2 generation, which is the generation of maximum diversity. Okay. And so you can get all kinds of different things. The other reason is because pumpkins are open pollinated by bees. And jack-o'-lantern pumpkin, Cucurbita pepo, is the same species as zucchini and as some of like the sugar pumpkin that we use to make pumpkin pie.
That's what I was going to ask that. Like, what's the difference between because I remember my mom needing to get a pie pumpkin versus a.
So they're the same species. The difference is that the pie pumpkin has been selected and bred for a high sugar, low fiber flesh. Now, there's been bred to taste good.
So it's kind of like dogs again, still same species, but this one's, the poodle got this kind of look.
Exactly. And your jack-o'-lantern pumpkin has been...
Are these cultivars? Is that what we call them?
Yes, they're cultivars. Level? Yep. Your jack-o'-lantern pumpkin, of course, has been bred to be very large, to be very strong, and to have relatively thin walls. And so what that means is you can eat a jack-o'-lantern pumpkin, but it doesn't taste very good. But because your jack-o'-lantern pumpkin is the same species as, for instance, a zucchini,
That blows my mind. They're the same species?
They're exactly the same species.
I'll never look at zucchini bread the same.
And so that means that, say, your pumpkin farmer was growing both pumpkins and zucchini.
Yeah.
It's entirely possible that the bees got the pollen from the zucchini and used that to pollinate the pumpkin. And if you plant those seeds, you'll get something weird.
What do you mean weird?
So it won't look like a pumpkin. It might look like a zucchini. It might have, warts on it, or strange protrusions, or an unusual color.
I think we've had this. When I was a kid, we grew pumpkins on our farm too, in a garden, and then sometimes pumpkins would sprout out from last year's that didn't get cleaned up fast enough.
Yep.
And you got some weirdos. They were actually kind of fun for Halloween, though, too.
Well, they sell them as kind of a novelty, I think that. But really, this is just, I don't want to say an abomination, but you're just talking about it's just zucchini and pumpkin mixing. That's all. It is what it is.
Yep.
Are there other things besides zucchini, the sugar pumpkin, your jack-o'-lantern pumpkin?
Yeah, so jack-o'-lantern pumpkins are Cucurbita pepo subspecies pepo. There are actually 5 different species of cucurbita that we use as food.
Okay.
And Cucurbita pepo subspecies pepo, in addition to the jack-o'-lantern pumpkin, the sugar pumpkin, and the zucchini, and the golden zucchini, because green zucchini and golden zucchini are basically the same thing. It includes a couple of others that we don't normally see in the grocery store. So there's the cockazel, which is a large green and white striped squash.
Okay.
And then the kusa, or vegetable marrow, which is very common in Europe and the Middle East, but not here in the U.S.
Okay.
And then down in Mexico, which is where all of these originated, they've got a bunch of other types of pumpkins that are grown either for eating or for edible seed. There's also
pumpkins originated in Mexico?
Yes. Cucurbita pepo subspecies pepo is native to Mexico. There's also another subspecies of Cucurbita pepo called subspecies ovifera, which includes the yellow squash and the acorn squash and the scallop or patty pan squash.
Okay.
And those are native actually to the Mississippi River Valley, including Minnesota.
Oh, okay.
And they were domesticated in probably the southern part, down around Mississippi, and then spread and were being grown by Native Americans from Minnesota all the way east when the Europeans first arrived.
I love a good acorn squash, especially right now.
But
did you say spaghetti squash too?
Yes, spaghetti squash. Actually, spaghetti squash is Cucurbita pepo subspecies pepo.
Those things are amazing. They just keep producing that pulp and it strings out. Yeah.
Scallop squash was the other one I mentioned. That's also known as patty pan. You may have seen it like at farmer's market. It's the one with the scalloped edges.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
So is it appropriate to call all of these vegetables squash or pumpkins, or obviously you're using the species name? What's the standard lexicon?
So the standard lexicon actually has nothing to do with the species. It is based on the shape. So we generally call round fruited forms pumpkins and everything else squash. The 2 words have different origins. So squash is actually derived from the Native American term in the Narragansett language, escuta squash, which meant a food eaten raw and was used to refer to particularly the patty pan or scallop squash, which the Narragansetts were growing in New England when the first Europeans showed up.
And they would eat them raw?
Yes. People still eat zucchini raw.
Yeah, I eat zucchini raw.
Yeah.
Pumpkin is actually from an old French word, pompion, which meant melon or gourd. And that came into use when the early French explorers in the Mississippi River Valley saw the pumpkins and squash that were being grown by the native tribes, and they didn't know what they were because nobody in Europe had ever seen a pumpkin.
Wow.
And so they assumed that they must be watermelons because that was the only big round cucurbit fruit they'd ever seen.
What a surprise they had.
Yeah. And they wrote back in their diaries and said, these are really, really awful. They're the worst watermelons we've ever tasted. But that name stuck and became, over time, pumpkin in modern English.
And what was that name again? What was that word?
Pompion?
Pompion.
Yeah. It's an old French term.
You said gourd. I was going to ask that next. What are gourds then? Is gourd just a general term?
Well, so it is a general term. There are multiple types of gourds. So the little gourds are actually Cucurbita pepo subspecies ovifera. There are also squash from any of the Cucurbita species that are mostly used as ornamentals that are not pumpkins, and they're generally called gourds. So things like your Turk's cap gourd. That's actually a winter squash. But then you also have the genus Lagenaria, which is actually native to Asia and Africa. And that's your bottle gourd or your birdhouse gourd.
Yeah, okay. The ones with the kind of like nose almost.
Right. And that's a completely different species, completely different genus, and one that those early French explorers would have been familiar with because it's native to Africa and Asia, not to the Americas.
So is a pumpkin a gourd then? Yes. It could be.
It could be, I guess, but we usually restrict pumpkin to the large, so like those mini pumpkins, I guess, is where it would overlap. Yeah. Okay.
I have upstairs our friend of ours gave us, it's a little white, tiny little pumpkin, a lot of ribbing on it. Mm-hmm. Is that what we're talking about? Is that actually a pumpkin or is that a gourd? Looks like a little white pumpkin.
Right. It looks like a little white pumpkin, so it's a pumpkin. Because remember, the definition of pumpkin is based on shape.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Got it.
But it is also a gourd in that it's small and it's probably not edible.
No, yeah. It seems like a hammer.
Yeah. Right.
And in terms of, though, genetically, it is not the pumpkin we were talking about, the jack-o'-lantern, pie pumpkin, zucchini.
Actually, it may well be.
Oh, okay.
So now knowing all of this nomenclature and what these vegetables actually are, do you ever want to go into the supermarket and just find the lowest price and be like, no, actually, this is the species that I'd like the price for this one because they're all the same? Or do you just grow all of your pumpkin gourd needs all of your own?
I grow most of my own.
Okay. Oh, okay.
But it's also true that all of these different ones have different purposes. So it's just like with different varieties of apples. You can go to the grocery store and there might be 10 different varieties of apples and they all taste slightly different. They all perform slightly different if you were to cook them. Some of them get smooth and soft and make really good applesauce, and others stay crunchy even when you cook them. Some are sweet, some are tart. It's the same thing with pumpkins.
They're not going to give me the Honey Crisps for the Macintosh price, is what you're saying.
No, they're not. But it's also not just about price. If I'm making a pie, I probably don't want Honey Crisp because that's a fresh-eating apple and it would be too sweet.
Yep.
Just like if I'm making a pumpkin pie, I want a sugar pumpkin. I don't want a jack-o'-lantern pumpkin. But if I'm looking to carve something to put on my steps for Halloween, I want a jack-o'-lantern pumpkin.
Yeah.
And if I'm looking to roast it for dinner, I might want an acorn squash or a butternut squash, which is a completely different species.
Did you ever do that, Brian? When I was a kid, we used to take the sugar pumpkin and you'd take the seeds out, but then you'd keep the stuff in there. My mom would put like rice and like a meat and thing. You'd bake the whole pumpkin in the oven.
No, yeah. I don't remember that at all. If it did happen, cool. I'm sorry, Mom. I don't remember that.
It was pretty cool.
Okay.
Yeah, it was like sort of it was
like a unique
a savory use of pumpkin.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We have a lot of pumpkins happening around this time of year. Obviously, some of those are seasonal. Do they grow? We seem to think about them right now. Is that their season right now, or do we see them other times of the year that we just aren't really watching them?
So this is the season, and in particular for jack-o'-lantern pumpkins, which obviously are the most visually obvious. Jack-o'-lantern pumpkins, because they're an ornamental, are like chrysanthemums or poinsettias or Easter lilies. They have a season. And farmers will time the production of their pumpkins for the pumpkin season.
Is that season biological or by what we want?
It's
like when
both.
I think I can get apples anytime almost.
Right. Well, so the difference is that apples aren't ornamentals. Okay. Right? We grow apples to eat. Mm-hmm. So both pumpkins and apples ripen in late summer and early fall. Mm-hmm. Right? Your August, September window. And the difference is that because apples are primarily food, there's a market demand for apples all year round. And so apple growers will harvest their apples in August, September, October, and put many of those apples in cold storage so that they keep and can be sold in February, March, April. Also, in the summer, most of the apples in our markets are coming from places like New Zealand and Chile, where the seasons are opposite.
Sure. Okay. And we just don't need that for pumpkins.
Right. So with a jack-o'-lantern pumpkin, the farmers harvest them usually in September, into October if they're doing a pick-your-own pumpkin patch sort of thing. But on November 1st, the market value of a jack-o'-lantern pumpkin falls to near zero. And by December 1st, it's absolutely zero. Nobody wants it. So farmers don't put jack-o'-lantern pumpkins in cold storage.
Got it.
So what can they do with pumpkins when if they have a surplus, or what should we do when we're done with our carvings?
Well, so when you're done with your carvings, the best thing to do with your pumpkin is to put it on your compost pile. Okay. Or if you don't have a compost pile, to put it in with your yard waste. For farmers, what they usually do is just take them out and spread them in a field and then plow them under, return them to the soil.
I have a ravine in my backyard, and we often toss them down there, and we watch deer eat them.
Yep, that's another thing that you can do. There are also in some places groups that do pumpkin tossing events.
Oh yeah, your pumpkin chunkin' and things like that.
Yeah, pumpkin chunkin' and pumpkin trebuchet and things like that, where people can bring their leftover pumpkin and pay a small amount and fire it at a target or something. Sure. To raise money for some good cause or whatever.
So one thing that I just thought about pumpkins is, are there seedless pumpkins? Do they make anything like that? Because like if I was carving a jack-o'-lantern, it'd be nice if I didn't have to deal with the pulp inside.
Right. No, there are not.
There seem like some that are like a little more airy inside and make it easier. Okay.
Right. So they do, one of the things they select for, and one of the big differences, in fact, between a jack-o'-lantern pumpkin and other types of pumpkins is that large seed cavity with all the air in it. But pumpkins are a mature fruit. That's probably the biggest difference between a pumpkin and a zucchini, is that we eat a zucchini when it's immature, and we eat a pumpkin when it's mature. And it's very difficult to get plants to produce mature fruit without seeds. Because remember, the reason the plant is producing this pumpkin is as a distribution system for the seed.
Yeah.
That's the whole evolutionary point of it.
Right. If there's no seed, the plant's like, what's the point?
Yeah. What's a mature zucchini look like then?
So a mature zucchini looks like a zucchini, except that it's 3 to 4 feet long. It's about a foot in diameter. Depending on the variety, it may stay dark green or it may turn orange. And it's got mature hard seed like you find in a pumpkin. And the flesh is bitter and stringy.
So if I let a zucchini go, I can get that?
Yes, you can.
Huh, I'm surprised.
It has to be growing, though. You can't have it picked.
Yeah, no, I know that.
All right. Well, I just wanted to make sure.
You probably won't get any more eatable zucchini off that plant.
Oh, okay. So sort of an endpoint for that plant.
Right.
Wow. Okay, so jack-o'-lantern pumpkins. Let's take a look at some of our options there. So I'm sure everybody's carved a jack-o'-lantern and gone through that whole process. Are there some... Well, one thing I see around this time or coming up is like how to preserve your jack-o'-lantern. So there's some gimmicks out there. I've seen some sort of a bleach solution, petroleum jelly. Those are the things I've saw. What have you heard? What do you know? Is there anything that works, or are they all like gimmicks?
Well, I'm not real familiar with those gimmicks, but I can tell you why jack-o'-lanterns rot.
Okay.
And so basically, the skin of a pumpkin is dry and very high in natural antimicrobial compounds.
Oh.
And it exists, from the plant's perspective again, to keep fungi and bacteria away from the seed.
Oh, well, yeah, that makes sense now that when you think about it. It's a force field for its seeds. Okay.
Right. Now, as soon as you cut open that pumpkin and start carving it, you're basically exposing the inside of the pumpkin, which is moist and high in sugar and starch, to the microbes. And the microbes look at that and say food and move in. So the reason why things like bleach or petroleum jelly would work to the extent that they do is that they either kill all the microbes on the surface. In the case of bleach, after all, that's what we use bleach for, is to kill microbes.
Sure.
Or in the case of the petroleum jelly, form a barrier so that the microbes can't get to those sweet, juicy, unprotected cells and can't move in.
Probably not a good thing for your compost for either of those, though, so you might as well just let it be natural, right?
Just let it be natural. I mean, the best solution is probably to wait to actually carve the pumpkin until right before Halloween.
Showtime.
Exactly. And then if it only lasts for a week past that, nobody cares.
Yeah.
We've also noticed that if the pumpkin freezes, then it's much more susceptible to rot after that as well.
And
is that because the shell breaks, maybe?
Well, yeah, it's because all the cells rupture.
Okay.
And so now the sugars start to leak out of those cells. And that, again, makes it accessible and attractive to the microbes.
So bring your pumpkins in if it's about to freeze, if you want to keep them a little bit longer.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
All right. Are we at like peak pumpkin? I don't remember such a pumpkin craze growing up. I mean, obviously seasonally they're always around, but I feel like there's more around, and maybe we see that with pumpkin spice. But I just feel like we have we reached peak pumpkin, or where are we with the industry, I guess?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I do know that part of the renewed interest in local food has been an increased interest in what we call agritourism.
Yes.
Which is all of these, corn mazes and pumpkin picking and hay rides and stuff like that. And that is very common for farms, around the fringes of an urban area to do, because they can often make a lot more money off of activities like that than they actually can from selling vegetables.
Sure.
So in that respect, I think that's become a lot more common as people have both moved away from their agricultural roots and become more interested in agriculture. Because you think about it, growing up on a dairy farm, would you have thought that going to a farm to pick pumpkins and go on a hayride was exciting? No.
That was always my cousins from Sheboygan. They'd be like, "This is so much fun." I'm like, "Do it every day."
Exactly. And as more and more people are like your cousins from Sheboygan, and fewer people are like you on the dairy farm, that's where you see more and more of the farms, including the dairy farms, honestly, with the state of the milk industry.
Sure.
Could you have a more Wisconsin phrase? My cousin from Sheboygan.
Offering these tourism opportunities, both to make money and to teach people about agriculture.
Oh, sure.
Okay.
But Halloween has also gotten to be a much bigger deal than it used to be.
Yeah, that's true.
I remember when I was a kid, Halloween was something that kids did. It wasn't, maybe occasionally adults would have Halloween parties, but it wasn't this huge decorating craze and store-bought costumes and...
Yes.
Well, there's a whole industry just around, yes, like you said, decorating, not only for Halloween, but the fall harvest time.
Right.
I'm so guilty of that because I
with
it's
your
a phrase
white
at our
pumpkin.
house. I pumpkin the house in October, the weekend, whatever it is, I just put so the house is all Halloween decorated now.
Yep.
We just did that this weekend as well.
Yeah. And, and farmers are taking advantage of that and coming out with ever more different types of pumpkins and, things to go with pumpkins. Like one of the big farms near me sells these little tiny hay bales for decorating.
Yes.
And it's like a 16th the size of a normal square bale. Okay.
Yeah.
Not to mention the round bales that you use for cows.
And probably 160 times the cost.
Well, right. That's the thing. They sell it for double what they sell a full straw bale for.
Yeah.
And people buy this.
Hey, you gotta get the money somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Okay, so where are you on pumpkin spice? I think
I was just gonna say same thing. Speaking of crazes, we have to address the pumpkin spice in the room.
I personally will not touch anything made with artificial pumpkin spice.
What is it?
I don't know, but I don't like it.
There is no such thing as a pumpkin spice, right?
Yeah.
Right. No, pumpkin spice usually refers to a blend of like ginger and cinnamon and nutmeg and cloves that you might use to spice pumpkin pie or pumpkin muffins or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that's wonderful. But all of this pumpkin spice stuff that you see out there doesn't have any pumpkin in it.
So it's possible that lots and lots of people forgot what pumpkin tastes like.
Yes.
Or have never tasted real pumpkin.
Never had it, yeah.
Right. Plus, remember that the taste depends on the type of squash you use.
Yes.
Sure.
I actually have an exercise that I used to do with my college students back before COVID, where I would take the 3 main species of pumpkin and make up a pumpkin pie with each one using exactly the same recipe. So the only thing that was different was the squash or the pumpkin.
Oh, okay.
And then I'd let my students taste them and ask if they could tell the difference and ask them which one tasted like pumpkin pie to them. And depending on where they were from, they would pick different ones.
Oh.
You know, because here in New England, people use sugar pumpkins.
Yeah.
But in most of the Midwest, they use Libby's canned pumpkin, which is actually more closely related to the butternut squash than to a pumpkin at all. It's something called a buckskin pumpkin, which is Cucurbita machata, which is a species of butternut squash. And then out on the West Coast, they tend to use Cucurbita maximus squashes for making pumpkin pie.
That's the giant one.
Yeah, but there are also smaller ones that are used for eating.
Wow.
I would imagine the maximum ones, like the ones that are grown, probably don't taste that great.
Not the great big ones. The smaller ones that are, you know, it's just like your sugar pumpkin versus jack-o'-lantern pumpkin.
Sure. Well, Rebecca, you have graced us with a wealth of pumpkin knowledge that we didn't know we were missing in our lives here.
This changed my life. Just the zucchini pumpkin connection alone is the first thing I'm going to tell people when I hang up.
Are there any, I guess, last-minute pumpkin trivia pieces or misconceptions about pumpkins that we didn't cover that you think we should know?
I have a question about pumpkins as far as their health. Like,
okay,
how are they doing? Are they being affected by climate change? Are they going to survive?
Well, they're going to survive because they're cultivated plants and they have us to take care of them.
That's good.
And they're annuals. So that means that they only have to survive one summer at a time.
Okay.
I think it is definitely becoming more challenging in many parts of the country to grow pumpkins for different reasons in different parts of the country. You know, in some areas, the problem is water. And in other areas, like New England and in some years Minnesota, the problem is too much water.
Yep.
And all of the diseases that can infect the pumpkins. Growing pumpkins, particularly jack-o'-lantern pumpkins, in the eastern half of the United States actually requires quite a bit of pesticide use because there are a lot of fungal diseases that attack pumpkins and there are a number of insects that will attack pumpkins.
When we think about, you mentioned the pumpkin seed farms that were out in the Pacific Northwest and the record heat waves that they had this last summer, does that affect the industry?
I'm sure it had an effect. Exactly what effect, I don't know yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if...
Because those seeds would be for next year, so we'll find out in a year, right?
There may be short supply next year, depending on how badly they were affected.
In terms of, we've talked a lot about genetic diversity for the pumpkin crop there. But for the most part, when we're growing these jack-o'-lantern F1 hybrids, are they pretty much one stock?
No, there are a lot of different varieties out there. There's probably 50 or 60 different jack-o'-lantern varieties on the market. And, they have different shapes, different sizes, and then different seed companies have their own sort of models. It's like cars, right? So you've got a pickup truck. And Ford has a pickup truck, and Chevy has a pickup truck, and Dodge has a pickup truck, and Toyota has a pickup truck.
Got it.
And they're all basically pickup trucks, but they're all slightly different.
Okay. So with your history of pumpkins, do you still carve them? Do you still make pies out of them? I know you talked about you made them for your students, but is it still a thing, or do they become like just, I don't want to see pumpkins anymore?
I definitely still make pies. I still put pumpkins on my doorstep. I generally don't carve them anymore. My kid's grown up. She's off on her own, and so I don't have any kids to carve pumpkins with, and I don't really have a lot of time for carving pumpkins. So
yeah, it is a lot of work. I mean, we did it when the kids were little, and I'm glad they've grown out of it.
Yeah. You know, and I also live in a neighborhood that has essentially no trick-or-treaters, so there's not much point in putting out a display.
Sure. Well, we still carve one at least, usually, because I like to blow lycopodium powder through them over an open flame. So, you have to have a fire-breathing pumpkin if you're a chemistry teacher. I think that's just like, it's part of the card-carrying package there.
Yes.
I don't think I had any physics pumpkin, lessons or demos that I did.
Yeah, I could think of some really cool ones for physics, though.
Floating, maybe. Oh, really?
Well, like pumpkin trebuchet, and how does the shape and the size of the pumpkin affect the arc and the distance of travel?
Sure. We have definitely, another thing that happens, I have shown clips of that when in school. The other thing was the structure of the pumpkin. If the pumpkin was too soft, the trebuchets, the acceleration on that strap pulls it and just mushed it, and then they say, I think they had some sort of, it was like a pie or something like that.
Yeah.
Rebecca, thank you so much for your time. This was a wonderful conversation, and like Dale had mentioned, this changed our world. We have learned a lot about pumpkins, and this has been a fascinating conversation.
Yes, we're so thankful. This is awesome. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Lab Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about some of the things discussed in this episode or previous episodes, you can find show notes at our website, laboutloud.com. If you have a guest idea or a future topic that you'd like to see on Lab Out Loud, go to our contact page and send us a message. Also, you can subscribe to Lab Out Loud on your favorite podcasting app, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to find podcasts. While you're there, leave us a review and rating. Your input helps others find our show. Thanks again for listening.